War is usually imagined as noise, explosions, shouting, chaos. But what truly frightened Germany's generals during World War II was not noise at all. It was silence. The silence that came after reports stopped making sense. In the summer of 1944, German staff officers sat hunched over maps in concrete bunkers, staring at red and blue pins that no longer behaved logically. Entire American formations seemed to appear where intelligence said roads were impassable. Units thought to be resting were suddenly deep behind German lines. Defensive plans collapsed not because they were weak, but because they were too slow. And behind many of those bewildering reports was the same name, repeated with growing unease: George S. Patton. Patton did not terrify the German high command because he was brutal. He terrified them because he moved faster than their thinking. By 1944, the German army was no stranger to speed. They had invented modern maneuver warfare. Blitzkrieg had crushed Poland in weeks and humiliated France in days. German generals understood rapid movement better than anyone alive, which is precisely why Patton alarmed them so deeply. He was using their own doctrine, refining it, and pushing it beyond what they believed was humanly possible, using American logistics, American fuel, and an almost reckless belief that momentum itself was a weapon. To understand why Patton's speed was so dangerous, you must first understand what speed meant in World War II. Speed was not about vehicles. It was about decision-making. In the German system, decisions flowed downward from the high command. Orders were deliberate, structured, and often cautious. By 1944, every major movement required approval, coordination, and reserve planning. This had worked brilliantly in the early war. But by the time Patton entered France, Germany was no longer fighting from strength. Fuel was scarce. Air superiority was gone. Communications were unreliable. Speed, once Germany's greatest strength, had become a liability they could no longer control. Patton sensed this weakness almost instinctively. Unlike many American generals, Patton did not believe the enemy should be managed. He believed the enemy should be overwhelmed mentally. His philosophy was simple: never give the enemy time to understand what you are doing. If they cannot understand it, they cannot stop it. This idea shaped every decision he made. When Patton took command of 3rd Army in August 1944, he inherited a force that had barely begun moving. Within days, it was advancing at a rate that shocked even Allied commanders. Columns drove day and night. Orders were short, sometimes shockingly vague, because Patton trusted his subordinates to exploit opportunities immediately. Where other generals waited for complete intelligence, Patton acted on fragments. He believed uncertainty favored the attacker, especially one moving faster than the defender could react. German intelligence officers noticed this pattern quickly. Patton's units did not behave normally. They did not pause to reorganize after battles. They did not wait for perfect supply conditions. They bypassed strong points, leaving confused German garrisons isolated and irrelevant. This created a terrifying illusion. Patton's army seemed larger than it actually was, because it was everywhere at once. One captured German staff report described the phenomenon bluntly: the enemy advances without operational pauses. We cannot determine his main effort because it changes faster than our response. This was not a failure of German courage. It was a failure of time. Patton understood something many generals did not. Modern war was no longer decided solely by firepower. It was decided by tempo. Whoever set the pace forced the other side into constant reaction. And reaction, by definition, is always late. Nowhere was this clearer than during the breakout from Normandy. Most Allied commanders expected a methodical advance once the German lines cracked. Patton saw something else, a fleeting window before Germany could rebuild coherence. He pushed his forces west, then south, then east, faster than maps could be printed. Roads clogged with refugees destroyed bridges, and fuel shortages should have slowed him. Instead, they became obstacles he simply drove around. German field commanders sent increasingly desperate messages up the chain. They asked for permission to withdraw, permission to reposition, permission to counterattack. The replies, when they came, were outdated by the time they arrived. Patton was already gone, already somewhere else. This is where fear crept in. German generals did not fear Patton as a man shouting speeches. They feared him as a force of disruption. His unpredictability shattered their ability to plan. Defensive lines that looked solid on paper dissolved because Patton refused to attack where he was expected. He struck flanks, rear areas, supply hubs, anything that caused confusion faster than destruction. One German officer later admitted something remarkable. We were not defeated by superior numbers alone. We were defeated by an enemy who would not wait. That refusal to wait was Patton's true weapon. Even Allied leaders were uneasy. Eisenhower, Bradley, and Montgomery all worried that Patton was advancing too far, too fast. They feared his supply lines would snap. They feared encirclement. They feared disaster. Patton accepted those risks willingly, believing that hesitation was more dangerous than boldness. And time after time, his gamble paid off, not because he was lucky, but because the Germans were paralyzed by speed. Patton once said, "A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan next week." The German High Command lived the consequences of that philosophy. They were trained to fight wars of calculation. Patton forced them into wars of improvisation, something Germany in 1944 could no longer afford. By the time the German generals realized Patton was not slowing down, it was already too late to stop him. Their reserves were mispositioned. Their counterattacks arrived where Patton had been, not where he was. Their intelligence lagged days behind reality, and every delay fed the same growing fear. This American general was inside their decision cycle. In war, that is fatal, and this was only the beginning. Because the faster Patton moved, the more reckless Germany believed him to be. And the more reckless they believed him to be, the more they underestimated what was actually happening. A deliberate psychological assault, designed not just to defeat armies, but to break the enemy's confidence in their own thinking. In the next part, we will see how Patton turned speed into a weapon so powerful that German commanders began planning defenses not around terrain, but around where they guessed Patton might appear next, and why guessing was never enough. By late summer of 1944, something unsettling was happening inside German headquarters across France. The war maps, once precise instruments of control, had begun to lose their meaning. Lines were drawn, erased, and redrawn, so often that officers joked bitterly they were fighting the enemy with pencils instead of rifles. But behind the humor was fear. The enemy was no longer behaving according to rules Germany understood, and that enemy had a name. Patton. German planning had always relied on anticipation. Even under pressure, the High Command believed that if they could identify the Schwerpunkt, the main thrust, they could concentrate forces and strike back decisively. Against most Allied generals, this still worked. They advanced deliberately. They paused. They consolidated. They waited for supplies, for air cover, for approval. Patton did none of that. Instead of a single main thrust, German intelligence observed multiple simultaneous advances, each moving at alarming speed. Patton's columns seemed to flow like water, slipping through gaps before they could be sealed. One German report described the situation with chilling clarity. The enemy does not appear to have a rear. This was not literally true, but it felt true to those trying to stop him. Patton's genius was not recklessness. It was his understanding that confusion multiplies faster than resistance. Every mile his army advanced without pause forced German commanders to make rushed decisions. Every rushed decision created errors, and every error widened the chaos. Patton was not just attacking positions, he was attacking German confidence in their own command structure. Nowhere was this more evident than during the rapid advance across France after the Normandy breakout. German forces were already battered by Allied air power and short of fuel. But those were not the decisive factors. The decisive factor was that German commanders could not tell where to stand and fight. By the time a defensive line was approved, Patton had already bypassed it. This created a deadly paradox for the German High Command. If they ordered units to hold ground, Patton simply went around them, leaving pockets of resistance isolated and irrelevant. If they ordered withdrawals, Patton chased them relentlessly, turning retreat into rout. Speed denied Germany its most precious wartime resource, time to think. One little-known detail from this period reveals just how deeply Patton's tempo affected German planning. In several instances, German armored reserves were dispatched, based on reports that were less than 24 hours old, only to arrive and discover Patton's forces had already moved dozens of miles away. Fuel was wasted. Morale collapsed. Officers began questioning the reliability of their own intelligence, not realizing that intelligence itself was being outpaced. Patton understood this dynamic intuitively. He believed that the enemy should always feel slightly behind reality, not drastically behind, just enough to be wrong. That small delay was enough to turn organization into hesitation and hesitation into paralysis. German generals began to describe Patton not as a commander, but as a phenomenon. One staff officer noted privately that Patton's movements felt less like a campaign and more like an advancing storm front, unpredictable, unstoppable, and everywhere at once. Such language was unusual in the rigidly technical German military culture, and it revealed how deeply Patton had shaken their sense of control. Even Hitler, notoriously dismissive of Allied commanders, became fixated on Patton. He believed Patton was reckless, undisciplined, and dangerous, but he also believed Patton's speed concealed weakness. Hitler repeatedly ordered counterattacks aimed at cutting off Patton's spearheads, convinced that his supply lines must be overstretched. On paper, these orders made sense. In reality, they arrived too late, aimed at places Patton had already left behind. This misjudgment was fatal. German counterattacks were planned against ghost positions. Entire divisions maneuvered toward objectives that no longer existed. By the time contact was made, Patton had already created new crises elsewhere. German commanders began to feel as though they were fighting an enemy who refused to stay still long enough to be understood. Inside Patton's headquarters, speed was treated not as a risk, but as doctrine. Orders emphasized momentum above perfection. Commanders were encouraged to exploit opportunities immediately, even if coordination was incomplete. This went against traditional military thinking, but Patton believed friction favored the bold. The Germans, accustomed to precise coordination, struggled to respond to an enemy who deliberately embraced controlled chaos. A striking example occurred during the race across northern France. Patton's armored units advanced so quickly that German troops sometimes mistook them for reconnaissance elements and failed to react in time. Bridges were captured intact. Towns surrendered without realizing they were being taken by an entire army. Speed created psychological shock, and psychological shock often collapsed resistance before a shot was fired. German field commanders began sending increasingly frantic messages up the chain of command. They asked not only for reinforcements, but for clarity. Where is the enemy going? What does he intend? How large is the force we face? The answers were vague because the truth was uncomfortable. Patton's army was not following predictable patterns. This unpredictability eroded trust within the German command structure itself. Officers hesitated to act without confirmation, fearing they would commit forces in the wrong direction. That hesitation was exactly what Patton wanted. He understood that a delayed enemy is often worse than a weak one. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect for the German high command was that Patton seemed indifferent to traditional operational boundaries. He did not treat army group borders, sector lines, or expected pauses as limits. He treated them as opportunities to exploit the enemy's assumptions. Where German doctrine demanded order, Patton introduced motion. Where German planning relied on stability, Patton delivered constant disruption. By early September 1944, German commanders privately admitted that they were no longer controlling events, they were reacting to them. The war, once governed by carefully prepared plans, had become a race they could not win. Patton had turned the battlefield into a contest of tempo, and Germany no longer had the speed, fuel, or mental flexibility to keep up. And yet, the greatest fear had not fully emerged. Because Patton's speed did not just break German plans, it began to shape German expectations. Commanders stopped asking what Patton was doing and began asking what he might do next. Defense became speculation. Strategy became guesswork. And in war, guesswork is the prelude to disaster. In the next part, we will explore how this psychological pressure reached its peak, how Patton's relentless pace convinced German leaders that he was capable of anything, and how that belief itself became one of the most powerful weapons of World War II. By the autumn of 1944, German commanders were no longer simply fighting Patton's army. They were fighting their own exhaustion. War is not only a contest of weapons and numbers, it is a contest of endurance. And Patton had discovered a brutal truth. Speed does not just move armies forward. It wears the enemy down from the inside. Patton believed rest was a luxury the enemy could not afford. His forces advanced day after day, night after night, often faster than official orders allowed. While other armies paused to reorganize, Patton pressed forward, forcing German units to remain in a constant state of alert. Officers slept in shifts. Communication staff worked until their voices gave out. The psychological toll of never knowing when the next blow would fall became crushing. German after-action reports from this period reveal something striking. They speak less about casualties and more about fatigue. Units described as combat ineffective were often not destroyed, they were simply worn down. Soldiers reported being moved so frequently that they no longer knew which unit they belonged to. Vehicles broke down not from enemy fire, but from relentless use. Men lost faith not because they were defeated, but because they could not keep up. Patton understood that speed magnified pressure. A slow enemy allows planning. A fast enemy forces reaction. But an enemy that never pauses creates panic. German commanders began to describe Patton's army as if it were alive, restless, relentless, always advancing. One officer wrote that Patton's forces did not obey the natural rhythm of war. That unnatural rhythm was deliberate. Patton drove his men hard, but not blindly. He rotated units aggressively, pushing fresh forces through gaps while exhausted units regrouped behind the lines. This created the illusion that his entire army was endlessly energetic. To the Germans, it appeared that Patton possessed unlimited reserves. In reality, he was managing exhaustion better than they were. This perception was devastating. German intelligence attempted to assess Patton's strength but repeatedly overestimated his numbers. The same units seemed to appear everywhere. A division encountered one day was reported again 50 miles away the next. This led German commanders to believe they were facing far larger forces than actually existed. Fear thrives in uncertainty, and Patton fed that uncertainty with speed. Perhaps the most famous and misunderstood example of this occurred during the rapid pivot northward to relieve Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. While much attention has been given to the brilliance of the maneuver itself, less discussed is the psychological shock it caused. German commanders believed Patton was fully committed elsewhere. They assumed he would need days, perhaps weeks, to reposition. Instead, he turned his entire army in less than 48 hours. To the German high command, this was incomprehensible. Plans based on Patton's presumed absence collapsed instantly. German expectations shattered. One senior officer admitted after the war that Patton's speed during this period convinced them he had prior knowledge of their intentions. They could not imagine such rapid movement without inside information. In truth, Patton relied on instinct, preparation, and relentless momentum. Speed made Patton appear omniscient. Inside German headquarters, fear took on a new form. It was no longer fear of defeat, it was fear of unpredictability. Commanders could not rest because they did not know when Patton would strike. They could not concentrate forces because Patton might bypass them. They could not retreat safely because Patton might pursue. Every option carried risk, and hesitation only made things worse. Patton exploited this mental paralysis mercilessly. He encouraged aggressive reconnaissance, not just to gather information, but to unsettle the enemy. Patrols appeared in unexpected places. Radio traffic suggested advances that were not yet underway. Feints and rapid thrusts forced German commanders to respond prematurely, exhausting their limited reserves. Patton understood that an enemy reacting too early is almost as vulnerable as one reacting too late. This constant pressure eroded German discipline. Orders were misinterpreted. Units withdrew without authorization. Defensive lines collapsed not from attack, but from anticipation of attack. Patton's speed turned fear into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Even seasoned German generals began to make uncharacteristic mistakes. They overcommit to defending secondary objectives. They launched counterattacks with insufficient support. They chased Patton's movements instead of shaping the battlefield. Speed had reversed the traditional roles of attacker and defender. The most haunting realization for the German high command was that Patton's pace had robbed them of initiative. They were no longer shaping events. They were being shaped by them. War, once governed by deliberate planning, had become reactive and chaotic. And chaos favors those willing to move faster. Patton believed that boldness created its own safety. He once remarked that a fast-moving army confuses the enemy so thoroughly that even mistakes go unnoticed. History proved him right. German commanders often failed to exploit vulnerabilities in Patton's advances because they were too busy trying to understand where he was going next. Speed became armor. By late 1944, German leaders openly acknowledged that Patton was different. He was not just another Allied general. He was a destabilizing force. His speed attacked morale, command cohesion, and strategic confidence all at once. He turned movement into a weapon and time into an enemy. And yet, the greatest irony remained. For all the terror Patton inspired, his speed was also a gamble. Every mile advanced increased risk. Every rapid maneuver stretched supply lines. Every night march exhausted men and machines. But Patton understood something his enemies did not. Fear spreads faster than fuel runs out. In the final part, we will see how Patton's speed reached its ultimate test, how the German High Command tried desperately to stop him, and how the legend of Patton's unstoppable momentum became fixed in history as one of the most psychologically devastating forces of World War II. By the final months of the war in Europe, the German High Command no longer asked where Patton was. They asked how soon he would arrive. That single shift in thinking revealed everything. Speed had altered their perception of reality. Distance no longer felt protective. Maps no longer offered reassurance. Patton had turned geography into a liability. German commanders began to assume the worst-case scenario as the most likely one. If Patton could reach a river in 3 days, they planned as if he would arrive in 2. If intelligence suggested he was engaged elsewhere, they treated it as a deception. This mindset eroded confidence in their own planning. Decisions became defensive, cautious, and reactive, exactly the conditions Patton thrived in. What terrified the German High Command most was not Patton's aggression, but his refusal to behave predictably. Traditional doctrine said an army must pause, consolidate, resupply, and reorganize. Patton treated those rules as suggestions. He believed that momentum itself solved problems. Supplies could be captured. Roads could be improvised. Resistance could be bypassed. Every delay, in his mind, gave the enemy time to recover. German officers noticed this immediately. Reports describe Patton's units appearing before defensive lines were fully formed. Engineers had not finished preparing obstacles. Artillery had not been properly positioned. Infantry were still digging in when American tanks were already probing their flanks. Patton didn't wait for perfection. He moved while the enemy was still preparing. This shattered German confidence in their own defensive depth. Normally, a retreating army trades space for time. Patton reversed that equation. Each mile the Germans gave up bought them less time, not more. The faster they withdrew, the more exposed they became. Rear guards were overwhelmed. Command posts were forced to relocate constantly. Radio communications broke down. Orders arrived too late to matter. Speed compressed decision-making to the point of failure. By early 1945, the German High Command faced a brutal truth. They could no longer slow Patton down. They could only hope he would outrun his own logistics or exhaust his troops. But Patton anticipated this. He prioritized mobility over perfection, fuel over comfort, movement over rest. When shortages occurred, he improvised relentlessly, rerouting supplies, seizing enemy depots, redirecting convoys without waiting for approval. German intelligence noticed this adaptability with alarm. They reported that Patton's army behaved less like a traditional force and more like a living organism, adjusting instinctively to obstacles. When bridges were destroyed, crossings appeared elsewhere. When resistance stiffened, advances shifted direction. There was no single axis to defend against, no predictable pattern to exploit. Patton's speed made him elusive. Perhaps the most demoralizing aspect for the German High Command was how Patton used speed to erase victories. Before they could be celebrated, German units would counterattack successfully, pushing American forces back. But before they could consolidate, Patton would maneuver around them, rendering the success irrelevant. Gains evaporated overnight. Morale collapsed under the realization. that even winning a battle did not change the outcome. This psychological whiplash exhausted German commanders. Some began to doubt their own judgment. Others blamed subordinates. Coordination suffered. Unity of command weakened. Speed, once again, attacked not bodies but minds. Patton had turned operational tempo into a form of psychological warfare, one that did not violate any rule of engagement, yet proved devastatingly effective. As Allied forces crossed into Germany, Patton's pace took on symbolic meaning. To the German high command, it felt as if the war was accelerating beyond control. Every advance signaled inevitability. Every delay felt catastrophic. The future collapsed into the present, and there was no time left to change it. Even after Germany's defeat, German generals reflected on Patton with a mixture of respect and unease. They did not describe him as the most brilliant tactician or the most disciplined commander. They described him as the most unsettling. Speed, they admitted, was his true weapon. It disrupted planning, eroded morale, and transformed the battlefield into an environment where hesitation meant disaster. Patton understood something timeless about warfare. Fear grows when time disappears. When an enemy moves faster than expectations, faster than doctrine, faster than belief, they become more than an opponent. They become a force of nature. And that is why Patton's speed terrified the German high command. Not because he was reckless, not because he was brutal, but because he refused to slow down, and in doing so, denied his enemy the one thing they needed most to survive: time.